Hello, before we start unwrapping the week this week, I just want to let you know about The Week magazine. It is a digest of the best news, reviews and columns from more than 200 UK and international sources. Packed with multiple perspectives, it gives you a unique overview of the most important topics and the most entertaining stories. And we've got an offer for you just for being a listener to The Week Unwrapped. Get your first 12 issues for £12 and a free Moleskine notebook too. Go to theweek.co.uk/offer and enter the promo code POD12 to get it. That's theweek.co.uk/offer and the promo code POD12. And now, on with the show. It's the week ending Saturday, the 21st of March, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen European cities on lockdown, school closures in the UK, and cultural events from Glastonbury to Eurovision announcing they're cancelled amidst the coronavirus pandemic. But we're here to bring you some of the stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann, and let's unwrap the week. And as I predicted last week, although I didn't actually think it would be all of us, we are recording remotely today, as I suspect will become the new normal. So joining me in digital form from the week's digital team is Joe Evans, Hollie, Clemence and boss man Holden Frith. How are we all feeling, chaps?
Yeah. Great. Lonely.
Yeah, slightly stir crazy.
So far, so good, but I think the madness will set in next week.
Excellent. And Holden, you're up first. A slightly absurd question under the circumstances, given our format of ignoring the biggest news headlines, but what do you think this week will be remembered for?
Have we underestimated the power of nature?
First thing is you decide which tree, and you just go up to the tree and say hello and ask permission. I like to blow into the tree to make a connection, but even that's not necessary. And if the tree says it's okay to exchange energy with it, because they are very sensitive creatures, you turn around, you put the back of your heart next to the tree, you can put your arms around it, and rest against it, and all you're going to do is receive whatever the tree has to offer you.
Shamanic guide Meg Beeler talking on a YouTube video on her channel entitled Energy Alchemy Exchange Energy with a Tree. Interesting choice of clip, Holden. What is the story?
Well, that was a video about how to perform some kind of psychic energy exchange with a tree, which looked very relaxing and maybe something we all need right now. But my story is about a more literal and potentially more useful kind of energy exchange in which trees can be used to generate electricity to power homes.
That sounds like complete fantasy. And what's happened in this space that makes you think that might even be possible?
Well, it actually isn't a particularly new idea, but the latest proponent is a Colombian-American industrial designer called Catalina Latero, and she gave a presentation to the Indaba Design Conference in Cape Town recently, proposing this as a way of getting green power to small villages in the developing world where there may not be an infrastructure. And the process works effectively by harnessing the static electricity that's produced when leaves brush against each other, and that electricity is sort of conducted through the electrolytes which naturally exist inside the structure of leaves and in the stems of plants. This process is happening all the time, and usually that energy just discharges into the air or into the ground. But this where this new process comes in is by using what's called a triboelectric nanogenerator, which basically involves inserting an electrode into the stem of a tree, and it collects that electrical charge, and that can then either be stored in a battery or used directly to power electrical devices.
I see. So these are extant trees. You wouldn't be chopping down trees to generate the electricity from them. You'd be tapping into the natural static electricity that a tree can generate by implanting an electrode in it. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah. So you just let trees grow as normal. The wind moves through the trees, they brush against each other, and then you harness that electrical charge.
Okay, I mean, that sounds to me, Holly, like something that is going to take decades to turn into a reality, even if you're taking it to remote villages where they have no electricity at the moment. So is that a worthwhile use of research time, do you think, given the environmental crisis we discuss on this show a lot?
I think it very well might take decades, but obviously still interesting. And they're also doing genetic engineering, like tweaking branch formation, increasing leaf thickness to make the electricity more efficient coming from the trees. But there's quite an interesting ethical debate about it as well that the team were talking about, which I guess might put them off if they find that it's not ethical. Talking about other plant diversity, it's something we've talked about before, about planting trees to try and reduce carbon. If we suddenly find out that trees are the best way to produce energy, what will happen to plant crops and wildlife, etc. They were looking at that side of things. So maybe that will slow them down even more.
Well, I mean, you've raised another question rather than answering the one I asked you. I mean, it may be interesting, but is it a worthwhile use of research time? I mean, you know, these are scientists. They're going to be spending their time on making energy from trees when we know you can make energy from windmills.
Yeah, they're backed by Tokyo Gas, so I guess it's corporate money going into it, which isn't a bad thing. And I'm sure a few people looking into it might be worth its while in a few decades to come when we look back and realise that the trees are the way forward.
Joe, what do you see as the issues here?
The issues that are raised are kind of two-pronged, I think. There's first of all, your quite kind of pertinent point that I think that lots of people will argue that when there's a kind of environmental crisis taking place, is this the most kind of useful way for scientists to spend their time? It should be said that in response to that, it's not just this kind of one lady that's looking into this. There's researchers in Pisa doing similar work, and also at the University of Washington who have conducted similar work on plants generating electricity. So it is a sort of fairly fertile space, and scientists clearly feel there is sort of something to it as an area of study. The other one is the kind of genetic engineering kind of argument. Latero kind of talks about how when they were doing their preliminary research, they started trying to do genetic engineering on an elm tree to see if they could sort of tweak branch formation or leaf thickness and density and try to find if there was a way to make it more efficient. It's striking that Holden said, have we underestimated the power of nature at the beginning, because they actually quickly found that the shape of a tree as is the most efficient way, as far as they could tell. But it does raise questions about sort of synthetic biology techniques and genetic engineering, and whether sort of tweaking nature for our sort of design is the right way for us to be going.
I mean, it may raise those questions, Holden. Wouldn't most people, if you ask them, say, yes, it is ethically correct to tweak a tree to produce energy, especially new trees you're going to plant especially for the purpose?
Yeah, it doesn't seem like the most pressing concern when you look at what we've done to the rest of the Earth's environment, even what we've done to farm animals in terms of genetic engineering, you know, changing the shape of the tree.
We were talking about bomb-sniffing grasshoppers, weren't we, just a few weeks ago?
Well, exactly. And we decided that was fine, so I think this definitely passes the test. But no, I mean, I think this does seem to me somewhere in between an arts project and scientific research. Like there's a lot of aesthetic interest in the idea of generating power without polluting the aesthetic environment as well as without polluting the atmosphere. And it's possible to think up slightly contrived niche applications where this might have a practical future, powering log cabins in heavily forested areas where you can't put a solar panel up in the shade and you don't want to build a turbine. But I think this probably isn't how we will power the world. Some combination of solar and conventional wind turbines is much more likely to be that kind of wide-scale solution. But if the last few weeks have taught us anything, it's that things can be really unpredictable. And in 30, 40, 50 years, we're probably going to be relying on some sources of energy that now only exist in this kind of speculative research paper, or even that we haven't thought of at all. And so I think I'm highlighting this an important story, not because I think this is what our future depends on, but just because we do need these sorts of slightly off-the-wall types of projects, because one or two of them may end up taking us somewhere interesting.
I think maybe we're thinking about this in slightly the wrong way, and that we're comparing it to sort of current forms of powering things through massive grids that are able to sort of power huge areas. I don't think the technology is necessarily designed for that. It's a fairly sort of efficient way of generating energy that the Terra kind of freely admits could be used to power rural areas or sort of areas that aren't properly served by power grids. And when Holden talks about us sort of thinking slightly outside the box about the way we might be looking to power these places in 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, these sort of more small-scale projects may well kind of turn out to have been quite sort of pertinent research areas.
I suppose as well, Holly, if you're a science teacher listening to this and you're going to have a lot more time on your hands very shortly, you might be reviewing the way you teach about static electricity because, you know, I think back to my school days and literally the only thing we were told about static electricity was it was to do with charges and you know, you might feel it if you're wearing rubber soles on your feet. I don't remember anything about leaves on trees giving static electricity or certainly nothing about how that could be utilised.
I'm sure we stuck electrodes in potatoes. I think there is an experiment at school. But yeah, I guess that comes into it as well, education, and maybe that will in turn produce more theories about where we can find electricity in all kinds of places.
I don't think the electrodes in potatoes is static. Can it get, Joe or Holden, have you got any memory of that?
I did the same, Holly. I used to have a clock that was a digital clock that was powered by electrodes stuck in potatoes. But yeah, I think that's something to do with chemicals or acids and enzymes. And
yeah, it's a good metaphor. I feel sometimes like hosting this show is like sticking electrodes in potatoes. We're going to continue doing that with Joe after this. Okay, Joe, your turn. What do you think this week will be remembered for?
Legal weed is fun indeed, but illegal weed is better.
Well, it's a product I'm passionate about, luckily. Cannabis. It's been amazingly gratifying, to be able to help provide cannabis to the people of Canada, where it is federally legal and where we're currently selling it.
Canada.
Yeah, in Canada.
I didn't know that.
It's thrilling. It's really a dream come true.
What's it called?
It's called Houseplant, is what the company is called.
That's nice.
Yeah, it's a lovely name. It's something you put on your shelf. I think part of it is for my whole life, weed is something that was hidden under the coffee table, and we thought we should name it after something that you proudly display.
Seth Rogen talking on Late Night with Stephen Colbert there. And Joe, that was a while ago when he was launching his weed company in Canada. What's the story now?
So yes, that was Seth Rogen, the Canadian actor and comedian who decided to go sort of legitimate in his weed dealings and form his own company. But it turns out that 18 months on from legalisation, lots and lots of Canadian cannabis connoisseurs are swearing by their underground suppliers and are sidestepping legal sellers in favour of the black market.
What's the evidence of that?
Around sort of 12 months ago, cannabis companies were sort of one of the biggest kind of tickets in the market, and billions of dollars were being poured in investment. And as 11 US states also legalised recreational cannabis, basically investors decided it was the hottest ticket in town. Now, billions of dollars are being wiped off those market values because essentially the legal market is really struggling.
But how do we know the illegal market is standing up? I mean, there aren't official stats for that.
So according to anonymous online surveys, in the last quarter of 2019, some 79% of weed deals were done on the black market in Canada. It's a slight improvement on 90% in the previous quarter, but basically legal pot has still got a long, long way to go before it sort of outstrips its illicit counterpart.
Fascinating, because Holly, the whole point of legalising weed, I mean, one of the points, apart from raising tax for the government and so on, was to nullify the illegal market. If it's legal, people will go out and buy it and they won't need to consult their friendly local drug dealer.
Yeah, and it's interesting seeing it from the UK point of view because it's obviously something people are calling for. It was kind of a shock for me because I kind of bought into those arguments that it could work and make kind of criminal associations die down. It would be easier to kind of make sure children weren't taking it, that sort of thing. But it obviously hasn't worked at all. And it's prices driven up by taxes, regulations mean it's hard to develop brands for the legal ones. So
that's very interesting, this issue of
worked.
branding. I mean, to what extent, Holden, do you think this might be a branding issue? Because if the Canadian government and other countries loosen the regulations around the way legal weed is promoted, then perhaps some of these new brands like Seth Rogen's would be able to, be a household name in the way that tobacco companies used to be. And that's the way to get people away from the product they have been buying, the illegal stuff.
Yeah, I think that's probably a big part of it. Capitalism is usually pretty good at selling things to people, but in this case, because cannabis is still in a slight legal limbo where it's legal, but there isn't. It's often still heavily restricted in terms of where it can be sold, how it can be sold, and also the sort of advertising and promotion you can do, which in a lot of places is actually zero. It does mean that the tools that companies would usually use to add value and add interest to a product just aren't available to them. You've seen a few companies, particularly in the US, actually trying to create more premium brands. So a company called Candescent in California promises the best varieties of pure, all-natural, sun-nurtured cannabis produced using sustainable practices, fair wages, and no pesticides. But it does seem that these are still quite a small niche, and it may even be that one of the reasons for arguing for legalization is that it becomes safer and you get a kind of a better product at a lower price once you eliminate the criminal element. But as we've seen, that prices because of taxes have been higher, and perhaps actually the safety isn't all that much of an appeal to some of these users either, because they like the sort of frisson of excitement that comes with an illicit product.
Yeah, I mean, maybe the truth is, Joe, that it's a completely different demographic, aside from the initial interest, when cannabis was legalized. Perhaps it's a completely different demographic that go and buy the legal stuff. Perhaps it is older people who are worried about medical concerns. Perhaps it's people like me. I mean, I haven't smoked dope since university. I've never bought illegal drugs. I only had it when it was passed around. But if cannabis was legalized in this country, then I'd probably be trying it occasionally. I'm a different person to the people who buy it at the moment every week.
I think that's absolutely right. And Holden is right to point out that kind of capitalism is traditionally very good at selling things. But in this particular instance, the kind of market has been massively hamstrung by all the things we've discussed, like taxes and kind of quite draconian regulation on advertisement. But I think it's also very striking that a lot of the people that are kind of talking about the sort of remaining black market are doing so on Reddit forums. And that kind of does suggest, as you say, that it is a sort of younger demographic who possibly were quite drawn to the sort of illicit nature of cannabis before it was legalised, and that are continuing to get their supply from the black market for that reason. I kind of had a little bit of a dig through one of these Reddit forums, and the kind of things that are being discussed, as well as sort of expense, and also kind of the suggestion that the sort of legal product isn't as good as maybe some dealers can provide, is this suggestion that friends don't let friends smoke government weed. And it does seem that there is still this sort of countercultural sense about smoking cannabis that the legal market just can't provide.
It kind of turns the idea of buying local on its head. People have obviously always been buying local with their mates and their friends and their dealers, and then suddenly you're kind of expected to buy into this corporate or government idea of weed. It's kind of counter to what it's always been, and counter to the people that buy locally and shopping. Very different, but I don't know if you'd want to. If you've always been doing something a certain way and then you've suddenly offered something that's more expensive, not necessarily as good, from a very different provider, it doesn't seem to work.
Yeah, can we just address that not necessarily as good point? I don't understand why that would be the case. I understand why it might cost more because of taxes. Why would it possibly be that users think the pot isn't as nice?
I think it's partly about the regulation of strength. So you can get much stronger cannabis illegally than you can get legally. But I think it probably also comes down a little bit to the placebo effect, which we seem to talk about quite regularly on this podcast. But I think if people feel they're going to a regulated shop and buying something from a packet with health warnings on it that's sanctioned by the government, it's going to be less strong, less effective, less of what they want than if they can go to go to a sort of slightly illicit place to get it and have something that feels as if it's somehow more authentic because of that entirely unregulated supply chain.
What's the response of the Canadian government been to this, Joe?
So as of yet, there hasn't been kind of any legislative changes. The issue kind of with taxes is that they're being sort of driven up because of the fact that the industry isn't raking in quite the kind of tax revenues that they were hoping it would. So in the first 5 months of legalisation, the industry kind of created around $180 million. It was projected to bring in about $100 million in 2019 to 2020, but it's actually projected to bring in about $66 million. I think part of the issue is that the Canadian government is going to struggle to respond to a lot of the issues that the industry is having. One, because it was legalised on the promise that it would generate huge amounts of tax revenue. Given that it isn't, they're not going to be able to lower taxes because they need to kind of fulfil that promise. And on the kind of advertising regulatory issue, it's kind of because the product is still sort of trapped in a moral sort of grey zone. Lots of areas kind of don't want weed to be heavily advertised there. They don't necessarily want weed shops to be kind of opening up left, right and centre there. And so the government is similarly going to have a very tough time sort of liberalising that issue as well.
Well, except the purchasing of the product from the black market is no longer in a moral grey zone, is it? That is very clearly now an immoral, unethical thing to do when there's a legal, safer alternative. So bearing that in mind, should punishments on people that are buying drugs from the black market be put back up to where they used to be? They were liberalised before cannabis was made legal, but now it is legal and you can buy it safely. Should they be putting those people in prison? Is that back to another thing that's on the table as a deterrent?
So the Reddit forums would actually completely disagree with you. They say that now that weed has become this kind of corporatized thing, they completely disagree with the fact that the sort of black market is still this kind of illegal, illicit corner of the kind of cannabis industry. They would argue that when sort of African Americans are disproportionately locked up in the US and First Nation Aboriginal people in Canada are disproportionately locked up for drug-related crimes, they kind of resent big companies making lots and lots of money from a product that they have always bought from their local dealer. Lots of people on the Reddit forums make the point that actually now selling drugs in Canada is a sort of regulatory and tax-based crime rather than a kind of morally dubious thing to be doing, because the only reason that the state doesn't like it when it's on the black market is because they can't control the supply and consumption, rather than because the state's worried about its kind of safety and that kind of thing.
But I mean, that isn't the only reason not to buy drugs from a drug dealer, is it? There's other implications for the misery of those people around them, which I guess it's not so fashionable to talk about anymore.
Yeah, so America's got a problem in that some of the states are legalised and some aren't. So I think they are arresting more people in the states where it's not legal, and they've now got the problem of people going over the borders more easily, and it's kind of boosted the black market. So in some ways it's not worked for the neighbouring states, and it's kind of made the problem worse for them.
And implications for the UK, do you think then, Holden, in the end? You know, when government does return to normal business and start looking at this kind of thing rather than coronavirus or I guess Brexit after that, do you think they might be saying, well, it hasn't worked in Canada?
Well, let me start that again. I think it's still an open question as to whether it's worked in terms of public safety. What this story seems to be is that it's not worked as a business. And so I think the one area where there may be clear lessons learned is in the valuation of companies involved in the cannabis business. And you know, there was a sort of gold rush, as Joe was saying, in the US and Canada when these companies went into business, and perhaps that's actually part of the reason we're now seeing a collapse in some of the valuations. In that, you know, a bit like the .com bubble, people were attaching unreal figures to start-up companies in the first place, and now we're beginning to see a bit of a thinning out of those companies. The less viable ones will be subsumed into the bigger ones, and then perhaps they will manage to create brands, and you know, capitalism will do what capitalism does, and the strongest will survive.
Ooh, so I think that could compound the problem, couldn't it, Joe? I mean, if we end up with, to make a sort of .com bubble equivalent, you end up with the likes of Microsoft and Apple equivalent companies owning all of the startups, then this feeling that, you know, big business has come in is only going to be doubled down on.
I think that will certainly, if the market becomes kind of centralised around one or two companies, as happened in the case of the sort of tech boom, I think that will certainly kind of exacerbate the issue with individual kind of cannabis aficionados feeling that the whole thing has been corporatised. I think Holden's right to point out, however, that this story is very much a sort of, it's put a huge dent in the kind of it raises taxes pro-business argument for legalisation of cannabis. What I don't think it does is put a dent in the public health argument, and I think that still remains kind of fairly strong, and I think the Canadian government would still kind of, and still does rather, fall back on that argument when the policy of legalisation is kind of put under pressure or under scrutiny.
And I think the difficult thing for these companies is that what you were saying, Ollie, may well turn out to be their biggest big business model. It's not that they're converting existing cannabis users and drawing them away from illegal street deals. It's that for them to succeed, they really need to attract a whole new audience of people who have drifted away from drugs or perhaps never used them. And that's a difficult argument to make when you're trying to get something legalised.
Holly, you're up next after this. Okay, Holly, you get to end the show this week. What do you think this week will be remembered for?
It's the week when the government took blue sky thinking to new heights.
These planes are going about 150 miles an hour. It's pretty fast. And in order to, if you've ever seen a skywritten message, it looks a little like a child has drawn it because they're writing it with a plane. And it's just very difficult to do.
You're right.
In fact, the word Pepsi itself apparently takes 17 different maneuvers and I think like 14 smoke releases just to make those 5 letters.
Yeah.
That's pretty tricky.
Right. Even before that, though, you have to have perfect conditions, like you were saying.
Yeah.
The whole thing starts at about 10,000 feet up.
Yeah.
Because up there it's cold enough, sometimes it's humid enough, that the smoke will stay together.
Right.
So it'll last as long as like 20 minutes under ideal conditions.
Yeah.
Plus it can't be cloudy.
Yeah.
Or else your stuff just kind of blends in with everything else.
Marry me, blob.
Right, exactly.
The Stuff You Should Know podcast explaining how skywriting works. Holly, why are we talking about skywriting?
So after a 6-decade ban, the Department for Transport has launched a public consultation into allowing skywriting back in the skies again. So if it goes ahead, we might be seeing advertisements, marriage proposals and other messages in the sky, and it could be as early as this summer.
I had no idea that skywriting was banned in the UK in the first place. Why did that happen?
So there were safety concerns in around 1960, and it also came during the Cold War, so there were fears that there might be a spread of political propaganda in the skies. So it got banned, but we're kind of out of kilter with the rest of the world because lots of other countries it's still legal in the US, Australia, China. So it would be
such a weird way to spread a message, wouldn't it? I mean, wouldn't you just get a leaflet printed?
Yeah, I think because it's so few and far between and we haven't seen it for 60 years, it's probably quite a good idea at the moment. Maybe if it became saturated and everyone was doing it, it wouldn't be so great. So,
and this isn't a coronavirus story, is it? This isn't a case of the Department for Transport thinking, we can spread a public health message, wash your hands or something?
No, although we have seen that in the sky in other countries, and I was thinking it would be quite nice to look out your window and see a message from anybody, while you're locked indoors. But it's not a coronavirus story, it's quite separate, and I think it's partly because Grant Shapps became Transport Secretary and he's got a kind of personal... He's keen to get this done. He's a pilot as well.
Oh, is he an aviation nerd?
Yeah, he was lobbying for it as a backbench MP, so now he's in charge. I think he's trying to push for it.
Okay. I mean, it does sound to me, Joe, I mean, you can disagree, like a very much niche concern of aviation nerds. I mean, it makes no difference to my life, really. We're talking about implications for all of us here, whether or not you can or cannot write a message in the sky.
So maybe a niche kind of concern for aviation nerds in terms of having it brought back, but I do think that if it was brought back, it would then be something that would impact on our lives. It's striking that some of the concerns when it was banned in the first place are to do with sort of the sky being turned into this sort of horrible billboard that no one can avoid and that is kind of infringed upon us. One of the most famous examples of skywriting was when a guy called Jack Savage sent a plane up over London to advertise the Daily Mail in the early 20s. And one Conservative peer at the time said that we suffer quite enough from the Daily Mail on Earth without being plagued by it from heaven, which I'm sure a lot of people would probably agree with. And I think that there's implications for everybody if advertising suddenly becomes this sort of unavoidable thing written across the sky every day.
Well, but hold on. Isn't it the case that you can at the moment do at least those banners that fly out the back of planes? That's how Nigel Farage had that plane crash on election day, wasn't it, about 10 years ago? It was because he was saying vote UKIP or whatever right out the back of a plane. So what's the difference between a banner and skywriting in terms of a message being in the sky?
So banners are legal, but skywriting and sky typing, which is a slightly different way of doing it, Hasn't been allowed, but it sounds like a very skilled job to be able to skywrite in the sky. It's like mile-long letters that you've got to do without really seeing what you're doing. I think there's kind of
I'm
romantic...
not criticising the professionalism of the pilots. I'm just saying, what's the difference? You know, Joe was talking about, we'll have advertising in the sky. We can have that now, but we don't really. People don't really fly banners very often.
Yeah, it's quite expensive. I imagine that's one reason. But I think there's quite a romantic, nostalgic feeling about seeing an aeroplane write something in the sky in puffs of clouds rather than a banner.
If anyone's prone to nostalgia, it'd be you, Holden. How do you feel about it?
Yeah, as a minor aviation nerd myself,
I just knew that would be the case. I didn't even have to ask. I was just like, yeah, he's the type.
Yeah, and there is a connection between the UK specifically and skywriting. It was first developed during the First World War by the RAF in its very early days, and it was essentially sending smoke signals to troops when they were out of range of telephones. And then a few ex-RAF pilots then started to develop it as a commercial business in the years after that. The very first advert was actually for the Daily Mail in 1922 in the sky over Epsom during the Derby, and that particular pilot then went to the US and convinced various hotel firms to buy into it as well. But there's a few, looking to the States now, there's a few companies that offer it. One called airsign.com sort of offers packages of skywriting and social media, because they say the two work really well together, because when people see the plane in the air starting to write the message, they stop what they're doing, look at the sky, start to take pictures, and those pictures then have an afterlife on Instagram and on Facebook, and so you sort of get the combination of the old and the new messaging.
Yeah, I did see an example of that sort of social media mishmash last week in Sydney. Did you see that, Holly?
Yeah, so someone had put into the sky, stop F1, which presumably is about coronavirus and not spreading it for the sake of money, as Lewis Hamilton was saying. But there's also, this social media part is quite important, because I think the industry was doing well until TV advertising came along in the 1950s, and it kind of killed it off because people realised that they could have a lot better widespread advertising through television boxes. But now you can take a photo of it. It's kind of got the appeal of Snapchat in that it disappears from the sky, but then Instagram because it looks pretty and people will share it. So it's not just the people that have seen it with their own eyes. It's getting shared around the world, which gives it a kind of double impact that it didn't have before social media existed.
I think the comparison with sort of combining it with social media is kind of an interesting one. It's been pointed out, as you've pointed out, Ollie, that it's a very expensive way of doing advertising. It apparently costs thousands of pounds to have things written in the sky, but at the same time, companies are willing to spend thousands and thousands of pounds on social media advertising campaigns, promoted tweets, promoted Facebook posts, etc. The guy that flew the plane over Sydney managed to make his story go viral in a way that promoting something on social media and spending thousands of pounds doesn't do. And so perhaps actually there is a space for it as a sort of advertising campaign or protest campaign.
It reminds me of, there was a thing, I don't remember if last summer or the summer before, where I think it was Sky Movies or Now TV did a giant sculpture of Jeff Goldblum out of sand and put it on the South Bank. Do you remember that?
That did happen.
Yeah, and it got a huge amount of press coverage. It was on the front page of lots of tabloid newspapers just because it was so weird. And it was to promote the fact that, you know, whatever it was, Independence Day was now streamable on Sky Movies. But it wasn't really worth doing, I presume. The cost of that would have been quite expensive for the people on the South Bank seeing it. It was the fact they all took a picture of it and put it on Facebook.
I think that's quite right. And if the government were right now to fly a plane over Westminster to write out the words, wash your hands, it probably wouldn't be worthwhile for the number of people that would see it from across the river. But I think it would also definitely be on the front cover of every newspaper the next day, all over Twitter. And in that regard, I guess it's kind of comparable to the Goldblum example, where the cost isn't worthwhile in terms of actual eyes on the original product, but the spread of the message would be very efficient.
And I think there is an appeal, especially now, of something that seems to bring people together. And, you know, more broadly, advertising has become very fragmented on social media, on TV even. We all watch different channels. But being able to put something up into the sky where it can be seen by potentially millions of people if it's over a big city, and it can be seen in that moment, and there's a sort of understanding that this is a collective experience, I think that does have an impact that you maybe don't get in other formats.
But we are not addressing the British climate. I mean, I'm looking out my own window at the moment and it's a completely clouded sky where you would not be able to do skywriting. That's an issue, isn't it, Holly? I mean, even if everyone wanted to embrace this and go for it, there are about, 30 days a year where you can do this in this country.
Yeah, although I imagine those 30 days are when we're all outside at festivals and gatherings and sports events where maybe that's where they'd be kind of best aimed at anyway. There is a slightly negative side to it that I wonder will filter into it later in the year, in that it comes after the Shoreham air disaster in 2015 when 11 people were killed, and that inquest is only going to happen this year in September. And I think that might bring back to the fore kind of memories of people with what happened then in the civil air shows. It had a big impact on kind of how civil air displays are held, and there's been a lot of tightening of rules, which is great, but it's made it more expensive and some air shows had to close. And I wonder if that being in the public mind in September might make it a slightly less popular idea.
Okay, well, like a message written in the sky, we are now about to disappear for another week. That is it. My thanks to Joe, Holly and Holden. If you can't wait for the next episode to be written in the sky above you, you can always download them on your phone. Just search for The Week Unwrapped using your podcast app of choice. Our entire back catalogue is there as well. And the great thing about this show, if you've never heard it before and this has been your first experience, it's always like this. It's always 3 stories that no one else was talking about. So seriously, you can listen to an episode from a year ago. It'll still sound fresh. I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer Sarah Miles at Rethink Audio. And until we meet again to unwrap next week, bye-bye.